thank you to the audience who is tuning in live on Facebook and YouTube. Please be sure to check your Wi-Fi connections, unmute your speakers there, and get ready for tonight's At the Virtual Table, which will be starting in just about 1 minute. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for tuning into tonight's At the Virtual Table. Here is Laura Washington.
Thank you, Brian. It's a pleasure to be with all of you again for At the Virtual Table. We're in the dog days of summer. It's in August, but you're not going to get any dog days here on this show. We've got a huge lineup for you, got a lot to talk about. But first, I want to tell you all about the great offerings we have for you at the Chicago Sun-Times. We can bring the Chicago Sun-Times to you wherever you are. You can get the Sun-Times e-paper. That's our daily digital replica of the print product. It lives all the time at paper.suntimes.com. All the info you need is on your screen. This special digital offer gives you unlimited access to both the e-paper and every story on suntimes.com for only $2.49 a month, less than $2.50 a month. You can get everything you need to know in the Chicago Sun-Times. Learn more and subscribe now, not right now, do it after the show at suntimes.com/subscribe. And now I'd like to bring in my co-host, Lynn Sweet, who's going to be joining me for this entire hour of conversation. And we're going to be talking a little bit later, Lynn, about congressional issues, infrastructure issues. But we're going to kick it off with our first guest, which is the Honorable U.S. Representative Jesus Chuy Garcia.
Okay, and I'll let you introduce him, and I'll jump in later on.
Sounds great. Everybody knows Chuy, and everybody knows him as Chuy, but I just want to hit on a couple of the highlights of his bio. U.S. Representative Jesus Chuy Garcia represents Illinois' 4th Congressional District, where he has served since January of 2019. He serves on the U.S. House Financial Services Committee, Natural Resources Committee, and most notably, which is a hot topic right now, the work he's doing on the Transportation Infrastructure Committee. Congressman Garcia was born in Los Pinos, a small village in the Mexican state of Durango. His family immigrated to the United States with permanent resident status. Chuy is a former Chicago mayoral candidate, and he previously served on the Cook County Board of Commissioners, the Illinois State Senate, and he represented the 22nd Ward in the Chicago City Council, among many other civic and community roles. Welcome, Chuy.
Good evening. It's great to join you, Laura and Lynn, the two seasoned journalists in Chicagoland, and of course, keen observers of local and world events. Great to join you tonight.
And we've been observing you for a long time, and we're really glad to be able to have this conversation. I wanted to kick it off with something that's on the minds of all Chicagoans tonight, and that is the tragic death of police officer Ella French. She was memorialized this morning at a very powerful funeral. Thousands of police officers, not only from the Chicago area, police officers and law enforcement people from the Chicago area and across the country were there. Many people from the community were there. And so I just wanted to ask you, Chuy, to just kick it off with just any reflections you have about what this means to the city. And, it's obviously a terrible blow to the Chicago Police Department, to the rank and file. There's been a lot of conversation about what it means for their morale going forward. But also, it's quite big questions about what does it mean for police-community relations. So if you could just talk a little bit about that.
Thank you, Laura. First, I want to express, of course, my deep condolences to the family of Officer French. I think her death, I'm hoping, will be a turning point and a coming together to have conversations about the future of public safety in Chicago. about doing it equitably. I think that this very, very tragic taking of a promise of the future of the Chicago Police Department, as she represented a new generation of officers who I think are really deeply committed to public serving, to the motto of the police department, to serve and to protect all communities. A 29-year officer, 29-year-old officer stolen from us, and her potential and her commitment to public service as we learned more about her life and her motivations and some of the things that she wanted to accomplish is a great loss and tragedy for all of our city, for young women, especially who have joined the police force, who want to diversify, who want to bring a new perspective to policing and to public safety. It was quite a moving service today, presided over by Cardinal Supich. I think it has captured the entire city's attention and imagination, and certainly our hearts and our souls. This is a part of, I think, the next page of what the Chicago Police Department can be. And we start off in this tragic loss of life, of that promise, at a time when the city is experiencing very tumultuous violence and crime, it seems, throughout the city of Chicago. So this is a great loss, but I'm hoping that this will serve as a rallying cry and a cause to honor her life, given her motivations to contribute to building community and safer communities across Chicagoland.
Yeah, and of course, we share your condolences to her family and loved ones. Then you mentioned it could be a rallying cry and a turning point. What exactly do you mean by that? Is what specifically can we do to build on this moment? I mean, are you working with folks in the community, with the police department, with other folks to make that happen?
Yes, and I think that Officer French's death and her departure has caused people who have had different perspectives on the Chicago Police Department, its history, and many of the challenges that it is facing, to at least agree that this was a most tragic loss, and that we ought to use the time forward, now that she has been laid to rest, of course, to remember her partner who was seriously injured and who came close to losing his life, as a turning point in our conversations about the future of the department, how we can improve relationships of trust and community building, and that those kinds of things can lead us toward a real conversation about what type of changes need to happen in the police department and how trust can be reestablished. Whether you're someone who historically has supported the police, or someone who is an organizer in communities at the Black Club level, or someone who has advocated for policy changes, I think this creates a new potential for dialogue and for collaboration at a time when a new contract will be under consideration by the Chicago City Council, when pending items pertaining to the consent decree are also on the table. The environment is full of possibilities and a new way forward to embark on a conversation and policies that can help bring everyone together. I have been working with community groups since last year to try to prevent violence in the street, especially during the upheaval of last summer. I've been working with people who work in communities to prevent and to intervene to prevent gang violence on streets in Little Village and in North Lawndale, given that we border each other, and two communities that seek to want to engage more deeply moving forward on Chicago's west and southwest sides. And of course, with people that have advanced policies that can bring the police department and communities into the 21st century on a more equitable basis, and ensuring that there's greater accountability in the police department.
And your work across racial and ethnic lines is well known, Chewy, and that leads me into the next thing I wanted to talk about, and that's the census. The new census data that's out. It shows some growth, significant growth among Latinos in the city, some loss among Black voters in terms of population, and there's been some conversation. And I know you've been part of those conversations about what does that mean going forward. It's interesting because you were at the forefront of racial change and political change back in the 80s when we had another ward remap that went into court and ended up creating new Latino wards, and not only bringing you into the city council, but also giving Harold Washington majority vote in the Chicago City Council. So you were in the middle of that decades ago. So here we are again. There's already talk there may be Latino conflict between Latino and Black aldermen, because there's a fear that the Black aldermen will lose seats, will lose power, and it's expense of Latinos. What is your outlook? Some folks are saying that the Latinos deserve 2 or 3 more new seats in the city council as a result of this new data. What do you think?
Well, as the census data so far, and we don't have the granular data to be able to make more concrete assumptions, it's very clear that Latinos in Illinois grew. We're now 18+% of the population. In Cook County, 26%, and in Chicago, just under 30%. So our community has driven much of the growth across Illinois communities. So it is, I think, quite reasonable to expect that there will be an increase in the number of wards in the Chicago City Council. What we have to keep in mind, of course, is the voting age population and then the citizenship voting age population. But overall, I think that it is safe to say that there should be an increase, just as I think there will be an increase in the number of state legislative districts that are supermajority Latino, or that create opportunities for the election of Latinos to the state legislature as well. And my personal connection to the census and to voting rights and to redistricting is very rich. I came here to Chicago from Mexico in 1965 when the Voting Rights Act was enacted. I was an ally of Harold Washington when he was a member of Congress, and he tweaked the Voting Rights Act so that he could be, without knowing, the beneficiary of that tweak to the Voting Rights Act to win a majority of members of the Chicago City Council to break the gridlock and the obstructionist bloc in the council in 1986 through a specially ordered election by the federal courts and a forced redistricting that also took place. So as we begin the conversations and tough conversations about redistricting, I'm mindful of adhering to the letter and the spirit of the Voting Rights Act, to ensuring fairness, transparency, and equity in the map drawing process, and of course to do everything possible to protect especially the 2 largest partners in Chicago that are protected by the Voting Rights Act, that is Latinos and African Americans, and to do everything possible to minimize potential conflict and not to undermine either communities that are protected by the Voting Rights Act.
How do you do that when it looks like African American seats are going to be lost here? If you go by the numbers, if you go by fairness, you're right. There are 2 large racial groups, but right now the Latino voters and Latino residents are the largest. So how do you reconcile? What do you say to Black elected officials that say we're not ready to give up any seats?
Well, it's important to recognize that there are both African American and Latino members of the Chicago City Council that represent non-Latino or non-African American majority wards. They include the 47th ward, the 49th ward, and the 40th ward. This means that significant change has occurred in the composition of Chicago City Council, and that the whole game isn't just about creating minority, majority, supermajority districts anymore. While I think those things are very important, I think the city is in a very dynamic place in terms of political change and policy, and that while we struggle and figure out as the data becomes available, the official data from the Census Bureau, that we be as respectful and try to iron out as many differences as possible. It may not be possible to have total agreement, but I think that coming to the table and being respectful of the protection of both of these groups will be an important part of moving forward and having a redistricting process that is not unnecessarily conflicted.
Are you at the table? Are you these conversations are already starting now. Have you been involved in these conversations? Are you trying to work as a broker? What is your role here?
I have been in conversations preparing for the likelihood of what we are learning from the outcome of the census. I've had conversations with some of my colleagues in Congress, with some of the African-American and Latino leaders in the state legislature in both chambers, and of course of trying to create as much common ground, dialogue, and communication between the Black and Latino caucuses in the city council, in the state legislature, and of course in Congress. It's also significant that the loss of a congressional seat in Illinois will mean that districts from congressional districts to Cook County districts are likely to grow. So there will be another adjustment, another layer of complexity as we do redistricting.
And that's a great place for me to bring Lynn in, because I know that's something that Lynn wanted to talk to you about.
Right, and thank you. So our next guest is going to be the national expert on House redistricting, Dave Wasserman. But when I look at census data, you represent the only Hispanic, the district designed to elect a Hispanic official. There is no way that, there's no way that there can be a second Hispanic congressional district. I just want to be clear on that. Do you agree with that, Congressman?
It's a bit soon to say that, I think. I really understand the importance of figuring out what voting age population and then another layer of and dose of reality, which is the citizen voting age population. And then I'd say a third one, which is effective voting power and a trend in primaries, because in places like Illinois, the primary determines who it will be. So
in the
I recognize the uphill climb to create a second congressional district, but I'm not ready to rule it out, though I see many obstacles in getting there.
Okay, and one of them is that you need to have, the reason your district works is that the map makers consolidated Hispanic populations on the north and south side to make the C-shaped district. And while the Hispanic population has grown, it hasn't grown in one place to create a district. But anyway, let me move on from that, because I want to get onto your congressional role. So the House is going to come back in August next week to consider a big bunch of business in the entire Democratic agenda, a bill of more than $1.1 trillion for what we call hard infrastructure. I know you're interested in it in your new perch on the Transportation Committee. Then that was a bipartisan bill passed in the Senate. Then there is the pending $3 trillion plus bill passed in the Senate, a blueprint, not a real bill that has details, passed only by Democrats in the Senate. Now, Congressman, I know in that Senate bill, there is language creating a way for a path to citizenship for dreamers, for farm workers, for taking care of people with temporary visas. You have been the only one, I think, who has vowed not to support the $3 trillion bill if it emerges in the House without the immigration language. But right now, you tell me, Nancy Pelosi said today she's going to consider the voting rights bill, the hard infrastructure bill, that's the $1 trillion one, and then the Democratic only bill. You tell me how you keep the moderate and progressives together in this vote.
Well, look, I don't see this fight, although many have characterized it as such, as being about progressives and moderates. After all, the passage of both bills, the Hard Infrastructure and the American Families Act, have been endorsed in a very strong manner. I think there was a meeting at the White House today that included Speaker Pelosi and President Biden. And President Biden, the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, and Chuck Schumer have all signaled that this is the Democratic agenda and that it needs to be passed. The $3.5 trillion it includes that pathway to citizenship. And as you know, the White House is mobilized to engage, as all the members who have indicated that they may have some problems voting with both bills. It is my sense that when we meet next week, we will be successful in moving both the budget reconciliation bill as well as the $1.2 trillion hard infrastructure bill, which I'm hoping will become amended so that we can effectively deal with climate change. We can make the type of green investments such as in transportation and in safe drinking water, the removal of lead pipes, et cetera, it doesn't have at this juncture.
It has, the hard bill has lead pipe removal money in it for Chicago that would come to Illinois. So here is my point. Budget reconciliation is a term that I hope we haven't made people fall asleep when we use that term. It's a fancy term for saying that the Democrats will use some parliamentary technique to let a bill pass with just a simple majority. So here's my question to you. Because you're the one who is threatening to withhold support, and you've got some people with you. Nancy Pelosi has a thin majority, so our listeners know. So right now, the provision on immigration is in. It's there. You got it in the blueprint. It's there. You're kind of worried, I guess, that it may be bargained away, which is why you have your threat out there, which gives you leverage. Now, if the Senate parliamentarian, in order to make this 50-vote thing work, the Senate parliamentarian has to rule that it is part of, that it will have a real budget impact. If some of this sounds to our listeners like legislative sleight of hand, it is. So my question to you is, if the parliamentarian says you can't do this, there's another provision that lets the Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer says, thanks for your advice. I'm going to overrule you. Congressman Garcia, would you then recommend that Leader Schumer, his second in command, Dick Durbin, then just overrule the parliamentarian?
First of all, I haven't given up on the Senate parliamentarian. I think there is a precedent. The Senate included immigration and reconciliation in 2005 as they increased the number of immigrant visas in that year. The budget reconciliation process has also been used for significant legislation, including healthcare as well as tax legislation.
Justify it to me.
Should the,
get to the bottom here. Get to the.
But should the parliamentarian rule against it, I would favor and I would encourage Senator Durbin and Leader Schumer to overrule the parliamentarian, given the precedents that the Senate has established prior. And if we have a majority in the Senate with a tie-breaking vote of the vice president, I think we ought to utilize it. This is a transformational moment for America. This package of legislation brings benefits to everyone across the country, and I think it makes perfect sense. I also happen to believe that it's probably one of the best ways to ensure that we re-elect majorities in both the House and the Senate.
On it. And just again, so I have you for the record, what exactly is your threat, if you could just state it as simply as you can now when it comes to keeping the immigration provisions in these measures as they make their way through Congress?
What I have said, and part of what the Senate has passed, is a provision that immigration reform will be a part of this package. Senator Bernie Sanders, the chairman of the Budget Committee in the Senate, has allocated $107 billion to ensure that this process would be covered as far as a cost for doing so would have it. And what I'm saying is that immigration reform and the ability for people to get their green cards in the US is as important as climate change. It is as important as renewing the Voting Rights Act to protect people's right to the ballot box, and of course, addressing things like climate change. It has been almost 36 years since the last significant immigration reform by the United States Congress. We've worked with national organizations and advocacy. Polling after polling has demonstrated that there is tremendous sympathy across the partisan divide in our country for immigration reform. This is the time to exert leadership and to help people, and especially essential workers and farm workers and the young people in the DACA class, which many call dreamers, and people who have been here from places like Africa and the Caribbean and Central America under the auspices of temporary protective status, to have a pathway to get a green card and to citizenship.
So do you have a plan B if by some chance this is jettisoned though from the measure in order to keep the Democrats together?
Well, plan B would be overruling the decision of the parliamentarian. My sense is that the White House, Speaker Pelosi and Leader Schumer in the Senate working together, that we can convince people that this package will give Democrats the best positioning possible in 2022, and that people all over the country will benefit from all of the benefits that this historic legislation would provide the people. This is what improves the quality of life of people in rural America, in urban America, and throughout, by investing in families, in childcare, in lowering prescription prices, in expanding access to dental care for senior citizens, hearing aids, as well as eyeglasses and eye care. These are very significant things that would be unprecedented and among the most significant in many, many decades in our country.
I know we're in our final few minutes here. In my reporting, I am not sure if I could predict that any of the 5 Republicans in the House from Illinois would vote for the infrastructure package if it's bundled together. If it's a standalone, maybe. Do you ever talk to the 5 Republicans? Do you have a sense that you could bring any of them along? I don't, but what do you actually have some insight as to an analysis if there's any way to get their support if it's a bundled proposition?
If both of the bills are acted together and by the Congress, I think it's very, very difficult. Some of our Republican colleagues in downstate like the provisions of the hard infrastructure bill. Many of them still deny, the ravages of climate change. Some of them continue to toe the line, the anti-immigrant line of Donald Trump. And of course, we know that he continues to be the most important force in the Republican Party. They don't want to break with him on that, even if they don't believe what they sometimes espouse in their re-election speeches. So it looks like it's pretty hard to see any of them coming on board if we act on both bills. But I think that acting on both the hard infrastructure and the soft infrastructure and all the benefits that it brings for people everywhere across America is in the best national interest. This would be the most significant thing since the New Deal, since the construction of the interstate highways, except that we will be addressing climate change, will create the basis for equity, and states like Illinois would benefit tremendously from both of these bills.
Well, actually, in the hard infrastructure bill, which has so many of the transportation projects that you've gotten involved in as a member of the House Transportation Committee, we have billions there. And because it was a separate vote in the Senate, it was able to advance. So as we close this out, everything depends on whether or not the strategy of your Democratic leaders, Congressman, to have these 3 key measures together advance next week. So we'll see what develops next week as we have, we'll get some real sounding, don't you think, as to whether or not the Democrats in the House at least can keep it together?
I think so. I remain guardedly optimistic that we will be able to keep our big and broad tent together, and that when all is said and done, that we will be able to have a majority in the House and in the Senate, because people recognize that we're at a turning point in our country. As you look around, you see the unprecedented fires on the West Coast, the unprecedented floods in the East Coast and the South. This is the time to act on climate change. This is the time for equity. And this is the time to improve the quality of life of people who had given up on government over the past several years. That was expressed in the election of Donald Trump. This is a way to bring the country forward and to show progress and benefits to everyone, regardless of where you live in America.
Well, we'll be watching to see how the dust settles, Congressman Garcia, and we hope to have you back soon to do a postmortem on it.
I'm looking forward to it. Thank you so much.
Thanks for being with us. Lynn.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Congressman. So in our next segment, we have the national expert on House redistricting, David Wasserman. David, welcome to the show, and I'm going to give you a fuller introduction in a moment. In this segment, we'll also be joined by Rachel Hinton, who's the Chicago Sun-Times political writer who's in Springfield. Hello, Rachel. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Okay. Let me tell you, David Wasserman is someone I'm so excited about talking to because he is the national expert on redistricting. David is a senior editor for the Cook Political Report with Amy Walter, where he's responsible for analyzing the United States House races. But he also is a master at redistricting, so much so that David's Twitter is @redistrict. He is renowned as an election forecaster in calling races in the House and Senate. He is a contributor to NBC News. He writes analysis in the Cook Political Report. In the spring of 2019, David was a fellow at the University of Chicago's Institute of Politics, where he led a seminar. I would have loved to have been at this one, called Mapping Our Future, Forecasting Elections and Redistricting. David, you're a native of New Jersey and a graduate of the University of Virginia. Welcome to At the Virtual Table.
Hey, thanks, Lynn. And I would add that UChicago is probably the only place in America where I could get around 15 students to voluntarily show up to talk about gerrymandering for 2 hours on Monday afternoons. So I can't wait to get back.
Yeah, David, I know what you mean. I served at the Institute of Politics as a fellow as well, and those students are amazing. They live and breathe politics. It's a really fun place to teach.
I remember you were there.
So let me do a quick setup as we talk to the master of redistricting in a moment. Illinois is a little different from some other states because the Democrats control the process. When you talk about the concerns Democrats have about the elections being rigged by gerrymandering, in Illinois, we don't talk about it that way because it's the Democrats that control the remap. So here are just a few things to think about as we start our discussion. The Democrats in Springfield, who Rachel covers, make the maps, 1. 2, our population loss in reapportionment means Illinois is going to lose a seat. 3, the population loss is mainly downstate, and the official numbers just came out. So, David, can you put the importance of Illinois in the context of the Democrats holding the House? And then I want to go into a few finer details with you, and then I'll throw it back to Laura and Rachel.
Lynn, it's paramount. Democrats have a razor-thin margin in the House of 5 seats. Republicans only need to pick up 5 seats to make Kevin McCarthy the Speaker. And Republicans have far more power over the redistricting process nationally than Democrats. They control some pretty big states: Texas, Florida, North Carolina, all of which are gaining seats. Georgia, where Republicans could purge 1 or 2 Democrats from the delegation. So that really puts the burden on Democrats to counteract that somehow. Now, Democrats have been talking a good game about redistricting reform. They've been all about H.R. 1, but neither the Supreme Court nor Congress, especially the Senate, has taken action to curb this in time for essentially the cartographic Olympics that will take place over the next 8 months. Olympics might be generous. It's more like an arms race. And so Democrats are going to be looking to 2 big states that they control, and that's Illinois and New York.
So right now we have 18 members in Congress. 13 Democrats, 5 Republicans. Because of the downstate loss, you have map making software and you have maps. And everyone, if you look at David's Twitter at Redistrict, and then you just add the word Illinois, you could see his hypothetical maps, which basically are what a lot of people in Illinois are working off of right now. So you have a scenario where even with the loss of our seat, you end up with 14 Democrats and 3 Republicans. So what happens in your map making that you're able to lose 2 Republican districts? Could you explain?
Well, first of all, just because Illinois is losing a seat and it's a blue state doesn't mean that's bad for Democrats. It actually creates some opportunities. When we looked at the census numbers last week when they came out, what we saw was that Cook County had far more people than population projections had anticipated, and that the downstate population losses were a little bit bigger than a lot of projections suggested. So that means that Democrats can efficiently pack Republicans into these overwhelmingly red districts downstate to try and create as many Democratic districts as possible. Now, traditionally, the tactic of Democrats in Illinois has been to pinwheel Chicago districts as far out as possible. That's why Robin Kelly's district goes all the way out to Kankakee County, and it could even add Grundy County this time. Talk about a culture clash between different ends of the same district. But look, Democrats have a lot of desire to keep Sherry Bustos' seat. They have
even though she's retiring.
Correct, especially because she's retiring. Keep in mind that they're going to have a hard time keeping that seat without her unless they really do something about that to make that district better.
You have a very interesting hypothesis in your software in map making, which is why when you look at David's maps and you're looking for definitions of gerrymandering, this kind of does fit the bill because these are all very jigsaw puzzle-like shapes, which is Democrats will say this ain't the year to change the system. So you put Democrats, as you go around the state in your cartography, you give college towns to Democrats. They're seen as Democrat. So I think in the district now represented by Sherry, when you redesign it, you put Western Illinois University and Northern Illinois University in it, just as an example of what to do. But here's my other question for you. Under the Civil Rights Act, which we talked about a little earlier with Congressman Garcia, we have in Illinois, as we discussed, one district designed to yield a Hispanic member of Congress and 3 districts designed under the Civil Rights Act to have Black members. But with population shifts, when you designed your 3 Black majority districts, or rather districts to yield the election of a Black member of Congress, are these majority Black districts anymore? Or it says the population changed so much that it's just different? Could you explain?
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, these maps that I've posted are not my ideas. These are reported maps based on my conversations with Illinois Democrats. And I can tell you, there is going to be some tension regarding minority representation among Democrats in Illinois. Now, it's going to be very difficult for Democrats to argue that one African-American majority seat should be eliminated to create a new Hispanic seat. That's just not going to fly, given the makeup of Democrats in the legislature. But in order to create 2 Hispanic majority seats without disrupting the 3 predominantly Black districts, they would have to stretch the south side of Chicago all the way out to Aurora, and they would have to stretch the north side of Chuy Garcia's district all the way out to Elgin. That disrupts Democrats' plans to maximize their seats in the suburbs. And that's why a lot of Democrats I speak with are staying true to the tradition of the earmuffs, to keep Hispanic voters together in one district that links the north and south sides.
So I don't know if you heard when I was asking Garcia about creating a 2nd district, because yes, there's more Hispanics in Illinois, but if you all don't live in a contiguous area, it doesn't work when you do congressional maps. It works great for a city ward map or whatever. He wasn't ready to concede the point. that you couldn't create a second Hispanic district. Do you see in your analysis in your reported analysis? And I'm glad you brought that up, because everyone who's listening, David is extraordinary. He's in a field of one in his redistricting reporting, and the maps I'm talking about are the way he expresses his reporting, where I'm using words when I write and we're using video to talk. He also expresses it in his cartography. But do you see a way for a second Hispanic district in Illinois?
It depends on your definition of majority, because traditionally the Voting Rights Act has prioritized what's called CVAP, citizen voting age population. It is absolutely possible to create two districts where Hispanics are a majority of residents. But when it comes to actual eligible voters, that becomes very dicey. My estimates, and this is still very tricky to calculate because the census does not ask about citizenship, but based on my estimates, it would be just shy of what's required to draw two districts with Hispanic citizen voting age population above 50%. That could end up being Democrats' justification for keeping the 4th district in its current configuration. Although certainly there are a lot of Hispanic advocates and legislators who would prefer additional opportunities.
Right. And Rachel, so here's in a sense the connection. If you have more Hispanic legislative districts or Hispanics are more powerful in Springfield, then they have more thumbs on the scale. So this is a very interesting dynamic, since they are the ones who draw the map. Even though, and they have options. So I don't see how, given everything else Democrats have to do, that creating a second Hispanic district would be a priority. But David, you now make me realize you still could do a district that would make it easier to yield a Hispanic. Not every district, by the way, no matter how it's drawn, guarantees who wins. One of the reasons people give an enormous amount of credit to Congresswoman Lauren Underwood is that she is one of the few Black members of Congress who was able to win in a district that was majority white. Speaking of Congresswoman Underwood, she is now the most endangered Democrat. It looks like in your reported map that she gets a great benefit in a new map, because it gets rid of almost all her deep Republican territory, especially, her district stretches to the Wisconsin border, and it gets rid of McHenry County, which is one of the, even though Crystal Lake is there, that has Democratic voters, it does get rid of a lot of Republican territory and gives her some other areas where there's actually even more African-American voters.
That's right.
What do you think?
If Democrats pass the map they want to pass, Lauren Underwood's going to hit the jackpot. Her current district voted for Joe Biden by between 2 and 3 points. If Joliet and Bolingbrook are added to her district and McHenry and Lake counties are removed from the 14th district, then Biden's margin would expand to 14 points. So she would be utterly safe for a decade. That wouldn't even fall to Republicans in a wave election. And the question then would be, where does Bill Foster go? Bill Foster actually doesn't have a ton of friends in Springfield, at least not compared to a lot of other incumbent Democrats. And so the map makers could be content to push Foster all the way out into the Rockford area, even though his district would still be pretty reliably blue.
Right. So Rachel, in Springfield, there's been so much focus that you've been writing about on the legislative redistricting, House and Senate in the Illinois General Assembly. Has any attention focused yet on redrawing the congressional maps? And if not, what do you think is going to happen?
Not yet. The census data that came out last week will likely cause Democrats, especially Democrats, but also Republicans, to come back to the legislature soon to potentially make amendments to that map. I believe that they might take up the congressional maps later on in the year. I believe that there's been already some murmurs around who might be moved where, who might be completely erased from a seat. That will obviously have political ramifications for next year. You know, the primary has been pushed back a bit. That gives people a little bit of time to decide whether or not they want to jump into this race or that race. But decisions are going to have to be made. This map is going to have to be drawn. We just don't know yet what the lines, what the boundaries will look like.
So you were at Springfield. Let me just spit out my question, Laura, then we'll get there. And we just finished Republican and Democratic days. It looks like from your reporting, we have 5 Illinois House members. 4 of them were there. The one who was absent was Adam Kinzinger. So I know in some of the reporting David Wasserman has done, it seems his district would be consumed by others. Was there any talk about Kinzinger's fate or his absence when you were there?
No, not specifically. I didn't see him there. He didn't speak, although the state GOP, their decision to not allow some candidates to speak was entirely party-based. But no talk specifically about Kinzinger, more so about we need to fire Pritzker, we need to reclaim these offices that, have once been held by Republicans. We can once more be in power. It was mostly just a rallying of Republicans and patting each other on the back and trying to, get support and candidates for next year.
Yeah, they don't even, and Laura, before I talk, Laura, I think you had a question.
No, it was related to the question you just asked, Lynn. So who are, and I want this for both Rachel and David, who are the most vulnerable Republican congressional seats right now? Rachel, you were saying there's talk about eliminating seats. Obviously, the seat that would be eliminated would be a Republican seat. So what are you both hearing, Rachel? What conversations were you hearing, particularly among Democrats, about the plan going forward in terms of who's most likely to? Some districts might be combined. Maybe there's some talk about obliterating Kinzinger's seat. But what are you hearing, Rachel, and then David?
Representative Rodney Davis was here today in Springfield for Republican Day. He said that his, political future is largely dependent on what the "quote unquote" corrupt Democrats decide to do with his district. There has been some talk about eliminating it or combining him with someone else and potentially putting him into a potentially challenging primary. So I think that's one to watch. Obviously, Representative Kinzinger is one to watch too. He has not made any friends, I believe, with Republicans in terms of, his outspokenness when it comes to former President Trump. Those are the main 2 that come to mind for me. And then, obviously legislatively or for state legislative districts, there are a couple of others, some firebrands within the House and the Senate who may be either combined or whose districts may be remapped, redrawn in such a way that they no longer have a political future.
Wow. David, what do you think?
Well, the irony is that the 2 Republicans at huge risk here are the Republicans that Democrats like the most. This is a raw political calculation to maximize the number of Democratic seats. In the maps that I've heard about and published on Twitter, Rodney Davis, who lives in Taylorville, his house would be put into Mary Miller's district, and his district would stretch from East St. Louis all the way to Champaign and become a Biden plus 17 seat. And then when you look at Adam Kinzinger, his district is ripe for elimination for 2 reasons. Number one, it's situated right between Chicagoland and downstate, right? So it is this buffer zone that can easily be dismantled into other districts. But number 2, Democrats figure that they're not eliminating Kinzinger so much as they're eliminating a Trump Republican who would beat him in a primary, like Catalina Laws.
That is such a good point. I want to underscore that no matter where Kinzinger goes, he is going to have, even if the Democrats felt like doing him a favor and saying, whatever you want, Adam, we'll draw you the district, he is going to have a Trump challenge in his primary. President Trump will be, if he does what he has done in the past, will likely intervene because he is one of the people who has been the most outspoken critics of Trump. And so in a way, I think, David, you're making a point. He can't be saved by Democratic map makers. I mean, that is the irony here then, right?
Which means he has to be, how do I put this politely? But, he has to be shed from the delegation.
Or else, unless he decided to go, if he and Davis, though, if they ran against each other, that would be more of a, well, then maybe you have a Trump person come in and divide that.
What I was going to ask, what about the calculus, the political calculus looking forward? If you do eliminate some of these folks, you create a problem in another place, in the sense that an Adam Kinzinger or Rodney Davis might run for higher office. They might, one of them might challenge the governor, one of them might, or run in the gubernatorial primary, one of them might run against, try to challenge Tammy Duckworth. Are you creating another problem by eliminating an enemy? And how much does that play a role, you think, David, in their calculus?
Well, look, that might be a second order problem, because Democrats' first priority is to prevent the House from going Republican, the US House. And so, look, the fact that Pritzker has unlimited resources to spend could embolden Democrats to go for more with the congressional map. And the fact that Illinois is a bluer state than it was 10 years ago also alters Democrats' thinking.
We know you have a good point. So today, I guess, as Rachel is saying, Rodney Davis is saying to Democrats, well, if you mess with me and draw a district that I will have difficulty running and winning in, then I'll run for governor, which leads me to think if it would still be a district with a lot of Republican potential, no matter what. If he can't win a district where he's known, how would he think he could run for governor and win in an area where there's a lot more unfriendly turf? So I'm thinking that one through right now. But I guess the threat is out there. And Rachel, in your story that you have today about today's events, you made the point that Republicans would like to win back state offices, but they have no big candidates. Is that going to change, do you think?
Is that going to change, you said?
Yeah, will anyone emerge who is a blue chip name, who Republicans can get around?
I think right now the party is trying to find those blue chip names and see if they will be willing to run for some of these top offices. And I think that those people are right now watching, maybe biting their nails, kind of watching and waiting to see what happens with the congressional remap, with the legislative remap here just in the state, to decide what their next political moves are going to be. While I've been here, I've talked to people on both sides of the aisle, and everybody tells me that they're exploring things or they're talking to people. And I think right now, especially for the Republicans in Illinois, the goal is to find someone who has the deep pockets that you need, especially at the governor level, the gubernatorial level, to fight Pritzker. You need some amount of name recognition, you need some track record to run on, but you also really need that money. And so I think that is going to finding someone who can do all three of those things, or who has all three of those things, will be key to seeing whether or not we see a bigger name on the ticket.
And on the money front, that name might be Ken Griffin, right? There's a lot of conversation around who would Ken Griffin, the very wealthy financier who also supported Bruce Rauner and other candidates in the past. What are they saying? What are you hearing about that, his role in all this?
The head of the Illinois Republican Party said today that he, has talked to big donors. He's, 200 calls behind or so, but he's trying to shore up support. He's trying to figure out who will support candidates, who wants to run, where can they put them. I think right now, all eyes are on Ken Griffin to see if he will come up with a candidate himself, if he, will kind of appoint somebody or tap somebody and tell them, hey, I want you to run against Pritzker and I will support you. But all of that remains to be seen. I think a lot of people are saying it's too early right now to really expect the Ken Griffins of the world to come out with their, checkbooks and writing $2 million, $3 million checks or more. Obviously.
A lot more than also since our primaries moved back to June, it's different. David, to answer, Laura raised a good question. Endangered Congressional Democrats. Part of me at first blush would say, well, freshman Mary Miller. But maybe not as endangered as I think. Mary Miller is probably the most Trump-allied member of the delegation. She had Georgia Congressman Taylor Greene come out and do a fundraiser for her. She's aligned herself with the most Trump elements of the party. So in your analysis, does that make her, she's going to be thrown in a primary with either Mike Buss, Darren LaHood, or Rodney Davis. Do you think her being the most strident Trump member of the Illinois delegation makes her more vulnerable or less vulnerable to defeat?
Less vulnerable. I actually think she's totally fine. She represents the viewpoints of her district. This is a district that by the time redistricting is done, could have voted for Trump by more than 40 points. If Democrats just, carve out a Republican vote sink that excludes Decatur and Champaign, but includes all the other adjacent areas of downstate. Look, I don't think that Rodney Davis would even bother running against her in a primary because it would be a fool's errand. Rodney Davis's ideal district is a competitive seat where he's the only Republican who stands a chance to win. That competitive seat might not exist after this redistricting round. But
what about running against Darren LaHood? They're two people who have been co-chairs of the Trump campaign in Illinois. They are not critics of the president.
Mary Miller versus LaHood?
No. What if Davis says, I'll just go run against LaHood because they're two like-minded people in a sense, and then you get rid of the extreme Trump factor. I know we're speculating now. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I don't think the geography really works for that to happen. You'd be talking about Darren LaHood, who is essentially a Peoria area candidate, and Rodney Davis comes from southeast of Springfield. Democrats want to draw essentially a walking stick between East St. Louis and Champaign that would bisect their home bases. So I don't think there would be a district or a scenario in which they would run against one another. And by the way, I think they have a lot in common ideologically. But the most common question that I get is, can Democrats really pass maps these ugly? And my answer is, have you seen what Illinois' congressional map looked like in the 2000s? When there was a district that was literally nicknamed the rabbit on a skateboard.
I'm trying to remember which one that was. I'm forgetting. Which one was that, David?
That was the Lane Evans district, Illinois 17.
Northwest Illinois, yes.
It meandered all the way, I believe, to Springfield.
So isn't it an irony that former President Barack Obama and his former Attorney General, Eric Holder, have devoted 2 years to complaining and campaigning against the Republicans gerrymandering and redistricting, yet I have not heard them complain about Illinois. Have you?
I have not. And by the way, I think the biggest redistricting weapon for either party in the country is actually New York. If you think Democrats are going to be aggressive in Illinois, Democrats could purge 5 of the 8 Republican districts in New York State. Wow. I haven't seen that written about in the New York Times, but that's under consideration right now.
Now, does it matter if they have a new governor or not? I'm not familiar with how they do things up there.
Well, keep in mind that Kathy Hochul used to be a member of Congress from Western New York, and she might have a vested interest in increasing the number of Democrats in upstate New York. And so she might be all too happy to sign a map there.
So that's the lieutenant governor who's going to be taking foremost place.
As we're winding down, Rachel, now I have an interesting thought. David has the point that Illinois and New York are crucial if the Democrats are to hold the House of Representatives. But do you think the Springfield Democrats who will make the map will care about that in the way that maybe seems to make sense to me at the moment, and they will have some parochial interests overrun the process and not make a map that maximizes the ability of Democrats to win? Do you think they'll care
about Congress? Yeah, I think so. I think that the Democrats here are definitely, they're not solely focused on themselves. They've completed their maps, and now it's time to figure out the congressional part of things. And I think that they're going to be thinking about the best way to capitalize on these districts, the best way to redraw these districts to make sure that, they can have Democratic strongholds for decades to come.
And with that, our final word. I want to thank all our guests in the first segment, Congressman Chuy Garcia, Rachel Hinton, the Sun-Times political reporter, and the Cook Political Report's David Wasserman, the national expert on redistricting. Thank you for joining us. Now I want to try and sell you everyone some subscriptions to the Chicago Sun-Times, as we do at the end of every show. I hope that you all go, if you don't already, subscribe to the Sun-Times e-paper. It's our daily replica of the print paper. It also gives you total access to all our digital offerings that live at suntimes.com. We have, again, our very special offer. You could get the e-paper and all digital offerings for only $2.49 a month. As you see on the screen, go to suntimes.com and subscribe. Until then, we'll be joining you again in the third Wednesday?
I think it's the 16th.
September 16th.
September 16th.
Another big show. Until then, have a good end of your summer. And again, Rachel and David, you've just been wonderful in joining us. Laura, what a show.
Thanks for being here, everybody. Great show.
Great
See you
to be
next
with
month.
you.
Yep. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.